Okay, I think this maybe now is. Uh-oh.
No, there is
Oh
one.
yeah, you have one. Okay, great.
Just it's a new computer, so I'm not really used to it yet. Where is it now? This one.
If we go down, it should be just okay. Yeah, here.
The first one. Oh,
This
this
one.
one.
This one is first, and then this is my slideshow. One of these, whichever is
Okay.
most compatible. But I think this one.
Maybe this one.
But
This
this
one.
one is the first one.
Yeah.
That's the most important, I think. For
Okay. So we could just play it from the stick, I believe, right? So
yes, I guess so. Yeah,
so
yeah,
then we
yeah.
don't need to. Just if it works. Kannst du schnell testen, ob's. Ah, das funktioniert nicht.
Great. And we can like enlarge it maybe.
Yeah. Sorry. And the other, the presentation just after.
Yes, and then that's the yeah. That's
Or do I enlarge here? Okay. So
great.
now we're ready. So I'm gonna say a quick welcome,
Okay, great.
and then I give the word to you.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Okay,
Okay,
perfect.
thank you.
Genau. Ist gut, Milena. Gut, guten Abend, good evening. Die heutige Veranstaltung wird in Englisch sein. We're going to have the conversation in English today because our guest is from the UK, so we have the language adapted to his language. So a warm welcome here to the Cafeturm, or as we now call it, the Democracy Tower. My name is Stephanie Schüppach, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Politforum Bern and the Curator of the Democracy Tower. The Cafeturm, or prison tower, used to be a prison for about 500 years, and now it's an open house for political debates, dialogue, and democracy. And we see ourselves as part of an infrastructure for democracy, as we believe it's important to have safe and open spaces to discuss and exchange. And to enable and facilitate discussions, we also have some exhibition elements. We have a permanent exhibition on democracy, which is based on 3 questions. Who is included in a democracy? How are topics being discussed, and also by whom? And also, how do we decide together? And the discussion or the presentation tonight is part of a series that we started 5 years ago in collaboration with the University of Bern and the Burgergemeinde, the Burger community of Bern. And so the university invites every 6 months a new guest to hold the Friedrich Dürrenmatt guest professorship and hold a seminar or a lecture in the framework of this guest professorship. And since 2019, we also invite the guest professors here to our tower to open the discussion and bring it a little bit outside of the academic context. And so we also think it's always important for democracy and for societies to exchange with people from different backgrounds, from different countries, and also bring in new perspectives, for example, from the arts. And so a big thank you to Thomas Nährlich from the University of Bern, from the guest professorship, and also to Oliver Lubrich and Mira Reinhardt to organize these lectures. And I'm very happy that we can welcome tonight the current guest professor, Johnny Pitts. Johnny Pitts, some of you might probably know him, or most of you, I'm not sure. He's a photographer, writer, and broadcaster from Sheffield, England. And in 2021, he received the Leipziger Buchpreis zur europäischen Verständigung at the Leipzig Book Fair for his highly recognized book Afropean, which was also published in German with the title Afropäisch, eine Reise durch das schwarze Europa. So the book is basically the result, or one of the results of the train trip through Europe which Johnny Pitts took, and he observed, documented, and met with the black community in different European countries. and the Afropean reality is made visible as an integral part of Europe's identity today. And so this work continues through a multimedia and multidisciplinary platform, Afropean.com, and this also aims to explore this kind of like social, cultural, and aesthetic interplay of Black and European culture, and also the synergy of styles and what is brought out of this union of these different styles. And from this research for over 15 years and documentary practice, to capture the nuances and complexities of Black life in Europe, Johnny now also aims to explore deeper and more universal themes surrounding the subaltern. And in March, he opened an exhibition called After the End of History, British Working Class Photography from 1989 to 2024, which is currently traveling the UK. And in this exhibition, he brought together working class artists who use photography as a tool to document and explore their communities, but also the world at large. And also his seminar here in Bern is exploring the subaltern and is titled The B-Side, Bootlegs and the Subaltern. And one question in the seminar is how, in the wake of various fractures across Europe, subaltern works and networks by people from the so-called B-side, this can be, for example, working classes or immigrant communities, could offer an alternative history of Europe that might be used to suggest also an alternative future. And so tonight, we will start with a presentation by Johnny about the findings of the research and also his experiences with the B-sides in Bern. And then this is followed by a short Q&A by me, and then we will open the discussion for you. As we are a smaller group tonight, I think this will be a good opportunity to explore and discuss more openly together about tonight's topic. So the discussion can also be followed in our live stream, so I welcome also everybody watching us in the cyberspace. And so the event will be filmed, and we also have a photographer, Susan Goldschmidt, and she will take some pictures. So if someone of you would not like to be photographed or filmed, please let me know now so we can take this into consideration. Okay, thank you very much. And the video will also stay online, just to let you know if you want to share it with other people. And people watching us online, they can also ask questions in the discussion part, and my colleague Rebecca will bring them in here in the tower. And the questions, well, the discussion is in English, so questions can of course be in English, but they could also be in French or German. These are the languages that I could translate, so but maybe they're also.
I just wanted to begin by showing my kind of very loose relationship with Switzerland. I found out, don't know what that's there. Oh yeah, there we go. I did some work with the Montreux Jazz Festival, and I found out that my dad, some 50 years ago, had performed at the Montreux Jazz Festival in 1972. And so this is a photograph of him taken by a Swiss photographer. I forgot the name of the photographer, but yeah, I'm a Northern Soul child, and for those who don't know, Northern Soul is this weird phenomenon that happened in the 60s and 70s, where African American musicians that hadn't really sold or done particularly well in their home of America would find a new audience in working class parts of Britain, especially in the north, where usually working class white men and women who'd worked in the pits or the mines or these very sort of manual labor type jobs at the weekend would want to let their hair down and go dancing, and they just loved this black music. And it was just interesting how like these kind of very literal B-sides that hadn't sold in America found this new life. And I'm literally the product of that. My dad came over with his band as part of his group, The Fantastics, and toured around Europe, and met my mom at a working man's club in Sheffield in this year, pretty much. And I thought I'd show some photographs that I've taken in Switzerland over the years. I mean, actually specifically from this Afropean journey. This one made the edit. This was shown at Foam Gallery in Amsterdam and also in Morges. But a lot of these haven't been seen. I think I showed them at the library. I don't know if anybody was at the event that I did at the library here in Bern not long ago. But So yeah, these didn't make the cut, but these are all photographs that I took as I travelled through Switzerland that I just wanted to share. This is Bern. This is Bern. And I was just really grappling, looking for any kind of signs of black culture wherever I visited with my lens, and trying to juxtapose images of black people in a way that looked very natural within the surroundings, that were almost playing with the icons of what we think of as European or Swiss or Bernese in this case, and trying to insert some black culture into these images. I think some of these were taken in Freiburg. Yeah, and this is the central station. It was so snowy back then, and just constantly trying to play around with kind of juxtaposition. This is on the train as I passed through Lausanne, and then yes, this is kind of the start of this is in Sheffield, where I was born and raised. I wanted to, after seeing this book, I wanted to perform that poem and piece of music for you, because my journey towards Afropean started from kind of not obvious places, just moods and energies that I was feeling. And for instance, in 1948, the year that he won the Nobel Prize, T.S. Eliot wrote his famous essay, Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, in which he states that culture may be described simply as that which makes life worth living. And it's what justifies other people and other generations in saying, when they contemplate the remains and the influence of an extinct civilization, that it was worthwhile for that civilization to have existed. This all sounds reasonable enough, I suppose. But Eliot encompassed a view that much of Britain and the rest of Europe believed to be true at that time. A kind of colonial view of culture, that this culture needed to be conjured at the imagined top of society, which is to say by the kind of aristocratic classes. And it was the duty of the upper classes to extol and disseminate the virtues of culture to the lowly masses, and that the spread of culture wasn't a two-way process, but only top-down. And yet T.S. Eliot's own definition of culture, that culture is something that makes life worth living, is evidence of a worthwhile people, didn't come from the top for me. It came, the landscape that kind of surrounded my childhood as someone born black, northern and working class in Margaret Thatcher's Britain, was constructed by what academics might call subaltern geographical knowledges, or what I've come to describe as the B-side. And just to reiterate, in 90s British urban music culture, very often lovers of underground music would buy the 12-inch LPs for the unofficial remixes or dubs offered on the B-side of the release rather than their official radio-friendly A-side. So the big popular hit was on the A-side, and then kind of the more experimental, in many ways kind of more, the version that had more integrity was on the B-side. And so I use this as a kind of analogy from for a kind of cultural framework. This notion of the kind of unofficial, unpromoted, but often more surprising and experimental and interesting alternative to the official is something that can be applied to the geography that surrounded the cultivation and distribution of the music. High-rise estates doubled as pirate radio stations because you could get the best signal from the rooftops. They doubled as concrete canvases for graffiti artists. There were barbershops nestled, very often Caribbean barbershops nestled within these estates that sold bootleg mixtapes, terrace houses that doubled as illegal blues party venues, hinterland topographies hosting illegal street parties. Illegal out of necessity because these meetings of cultures couldn't have taken place in an official capacity. And these were the spaces that contained the pulse of black life in Sheffield for me, the city where I was born and raised. It was where you could find the type of multicultural that is kind of antithetical to the corporate, commodified multiculti that we sometimes see in government and in big business. Organic, clandestine meeting spaces for those of us living on the B-side of Britain without any real chance of being documented properly. It should be said that these estates, these kind of B-side geographies, weren't perfect. They did have their problems. People often were being forgotten and left to live in poverty. But they also produced culture. And I'm thinking of a British context here, but artists like Tiny Temper was born in a famous estate in the UK, as was Dizzy Rascal, Tinchy Strider, Stormzy, So Solid Crew, all the big urban culture, the big names that have produced some of the most innovative music in Britain over the past 20, 30 years. Think of Goldie, the rise of drum and bass and jungle coming out of an estate in Birmingham or Walsall. Yeah, and even somebody like Tricky, who pioneered trip hop, was from the Knoll West estate in Bristol. And these are people who kind of completely transformed the face of British music with innovative, futuristic sounds crafted on the B-side of Britain, sounds that I think embody the very definition of culture. And many of the artists I've mentioned no longer live in the estates that crafted their sounds. And it's good that people can move on and outgrow a place and live more comfortably. But we need to pay attention to the geographies that allowed such creativity to exist. And I say that because, and the reason why I found this quite touching, this book, is that clearly Bern hasn't actually changed all that much. Whereas a lot of the places that I grew up had changed considerably. By the time I'd turned 25, there were no remains, to use T.S. Eliot's words, of my civilization left for me to contemplate, because the civilization I'd taken part in already seemed extinct. The landscape of my childhood had vanished. My first youth club, housed in a brutalist estate, the first club I'd ever danced in, my first place of work, the building that housed my lifelong Caribbean barbershop, the market I have some of my earliest memories of my grandma, the street that used to house a local street carnival that brought the working class black and white communities together, and the building that housed the shebeen where my mother and father met. It had all been demolished with scant evidence that it had ever existed by the time I'd turned 25. And I began to realize that, my great-great-grandkids probably be able to come to Bern and get a similar sense of a city that their great-great-great-grandfather had understood and seen. Unless something truly catastrophic happens, they'll be able to stand on Waterloo Bridge and look at the same St Paul's Cathedral or Houses of Parliament in London as I can now. And I think landscapes are encoded with histories, narratives. They suggest identities, preserve culture and history. And some cultural landscapes are better preserved than others. The things attached to the culture that helped to give birth to and sustain me make my life worth living, to use Eliot's words again, in an otherwise pretty impoverished and depressing situation, are constantly in danger of being lost. In a 2014 conversation with Paul Gilroy at the University of Cambridge in a slightly different context, he speaks with Cornel West, the African-American academic, who mentions that empowered black traditions are actually quite fragile traditions with a long history of being crushed, and how black communities have long had to find creative and sometimes clandestine ways to preserve memories and legacies that very often die with each generation. My cousin described the destruction of the working class landscape that we grew up in as like losing a hard drive with all of his memories on it. These underground histories, the people who came along created magic in an impossible situation from whom we can learn from and build upon, hidden under kind of a hegemony. And I thought that if my own psychic geography was disappearing, I began to wonder about other histories, both working class and black, and how I might begin to unearth them. I had a natural kind of mistrust of formal education, and I was guided by seminal texts by people like Paul Gilroy and Stuart Hall and Edward Said and Francois Maspero and so on, and the negritude movement, Aimé Césaire. I wanted to find a way to arrive at black Europe from the street up in the way that I'd kind of been born and raised. Knowledge and history from equally ephemeral landscapes and local knowledges. And so I headed out on a Eurostar one cold October afternoon, searching for black Europe. I was looking for landscapes and I found locals. And it was through these conversations that a kind of imaginative map of black Europe was born, a layered map that blended actual physical geography with rumours and whispers of a ghost geography, of buried histories in local knowledges. And then also a kind of map of potentiality, and one that kind of didn't officially exist, but made possible connections between otherwise disparate groups. For instance, I don't know how many people here know about the Grenfell Tower tragedy in London. It's when in 2017 an impoverished council estate in one of London's most affluent suburbs burned to the ground due to years of government neglect, and then received this kind of awful backlash when it turned out that many of the residents were so-called immigrants. But I think the survivors of Grenfell Tower in London have a lot to talk about with the survivors of the Belmer disaster in Amsterdam, when an aeroplane crashed into a large estate that housed the Surinamese community in 1993. And there was a similar kind of anti-immigrant lack of empathy from so many people when they realized who the victims of this crash were and who was living in this building. A similar thing happened with the collapsing buildings in the North African market district of Noailles in Marseille quite recently. These B-side geographies, I think, need to talk to each other and share histories in order to empower themselves. And I keep thinking of how kind of various media, the stuff like, I don't know, pirate cassette tapes and bootleg VHS tapes, scrapbooks of graffiti, might be used to preserve these landscapes as spectres, haunted media containing not just the unofficial sounds and visuals of a place, but also their textures, their atmospheres. I'm thinking here, I think of this a lot. There's a Hong Kong auteur, filmmaker called Wong Kar-wai, who made all of these, and there's this weird sort of connection to black culture as well, as they're often between Hong Kong and black culture. You listen to one of the most famous hip-hop albums of all time, 1994's 36 Chambers by Wu-Tang Clan, and it's interspersed with all these pirated Hong Kong martial arts films. And a lot of Hong Kong movies came to me in my local barbershop, my Caribbean barbershop, and there'd be this guy who'd come in from China, who was Chinese, and he'd been to Hong Kong, and he'd picked up all these bootlegs of all these martial arts tapes and brought them to sell at like kind of cheap prices for us. And so like that's my first encounter with Wong Kar-wai's movies, on these VHS tapes that were pirated. Sometimes you'd even watch it and see somebody walking in front of the screen, because it had been recorded from a cinema. And I'd never thought about this, but that's what I associate with the ambience of Wong Kar-wai's films. And it's interesting that very recently, Wong Kar-wai's movies were digitally remastered, and he didn't really like this idea. He agreed to it eventually, but he was saying, when I'm showing people these digital remasters of these films, they feel like something's missing, as if they're not the same as they used to be. And then he said, and I think it's because people experience my films for the first time on pirated VHS tapes. And when I think of something like one of his masterpieces, which is a film called Chungking Express, which is about the Chungking mansions in Hong Kong, where a lot of immigrant communities are, there's a big Indian community, a big West African community who kind of make their way in Hong Kong in this building. And the film is in some ways a documentation of this place. I think it's interesting to think that the pirated cassette tape of Chungking Express is closer somehow to the thing that it is being documented than the digital remaster, you know, because you could imagine how this pirated cassette tape would have actually possibly even made its way through Chungking mansions in this kind of subaltern network. And these textures and spectres really inform my work, and I'm constantly thinking of how I might be able to capture them. Capture their atmospheres, their kind of alternative wisdom, in a way that is not obvious. There's a long tradition of people who've tried to do this. I'm thinking of the African-American photographer Roy DeCarava, who often rejected the notion of shooting in daylight and using light for his photography, and went into the basements of jazz clubs in Harlem in the 50s. And so his images are full of camera shake and blurs, and they're almost a visual interpretation of black music in the 1950s. You know, to document it cleanly wouldn't have been the thing, because jazz in that space and in that era wasn't clean. I'm kind of thinking of this 1987 novel Songlines by another Sheffield-born writer called Bruce Chatwin, who explored Australia and the Aboriginal Dreamtime, which sang the kind of through these songlines, which sang the land into existence for kind of the conscious mind and memory. The term songline describes the features and directions of travel that were included in a song that had to be sung and memorized for the traveller to know the route to their destination. The idea is that as they walked and sang, the land, the tree, the path came to be. And these kind of ancient sonic maps are preserved in the songlines of what is the world's oldest living culture. What kind of songlines could we produce in the 21st century in order to preserve culture in danger of being lost because it isn't valued by the mainstream or the current economic system that we're living under? Yeah, so to go back to that idea of documenting ghosts, that I already find that in my book Afropean, which is a documentation of a landscape, and in all my books, I try to have my books have more than one purpose. So on the one hand, it's a piece of creative non-fiction, it's a travel narrative, a subjective travel narrative. On the other hand, though, I wanted it to serve as a kind of guidebook for the black community, so anybody reading it would know when they were coming to Europe, the areas where they might be welcomed or the first points of call, you know. But it's interesting that, so this landscape is preserved in that book, but already most of the pictures that I've taken are of places that no longer exist anymore, pieces of graffiti that have faded, businesses that are no longer there. And so like there is this landscape that is encoded in this book that no longer exists. And again, to go back to that notion of how to capture it, I think about an artist called John Akomfrah, who talked about listening to this song by the blues musician Howlin' Wolf, in which he's talking about his .44 Magnum pistol. And John Akomfrah talks about listening to this song. I'm wondering what the hell he's angry about, you know, because there's anger there, but it's not clear what he's angry about. And actually, encoded in that song is, of course, the anger of being black in America. And it's not overtly projected. It's encoded in the texture and in the sonics. Paul Gilroy calls this black vernacular culture. And he talks about how James Brown, for instance, when James Brown is yelling, it's more than just a yell that you're hearing. You're hearing an expression of the inexpressible. You're hearing encoded in that yell. It's more eloquent. If you listen to James Brown yelling, it tells you more about the black experience than 90% of the essays that you could read about the black community. And just to finish, what's important to remember about these B-side geographies is that they're places in flux. A healthy B-side is something that could potentially, I think, veer towards something bohemian and convivial, not in a superficial way. It's this place where people arrive, they learn, they adopt culture, and then they enter society, and it's constantly moving. There are new generations, new energies, making this B-side work, these B-side geographies work. And I'm thinking of something like the ship of Theseus, where if the ship slowly gets different pieces of its body repaired until at the end none of the original pieces of the ship are there, is it still the same ship? And I think it is the same ship, and I think these geographies are the same places, but just different people pass through them and go on to take part in society. But Doug Saunders, who wrote an excellent book, Arrival City, cautions us against vilifying or completely demolishing these B-side enclaves on the edges of big cities, or what he calls arrival cities, due to them often being places where the first generation of immigrants will make a home in order for the second generation to then leave and potentially go to university or get a professional career. And I think if we neglect these places, they turn into the B-side. The B-side can burst. That's when we see things like the riots in Paris or London. It's when there's decades of neglect that leads to what he calls failed arrival, when people can't move on, they can't leave the B-side, they're trapped. They see their parents working hard as in manual jobs and not progressing and not providing, and they're not getting a platform. Despite actually being born in the new country. And I want to quote him here. He says, if left to its own devices and deprived of access to the larger political system, the arrival city will generate a defensive politics of its own. In Brazil, it took the shape of the drug gang. In Mumbai, it's Hindu nationalism. The arrival city wants to be normal, wants to be included. And if it's given the resources to do so, it'll flourish. But without them, it's likely to explode. The arrival city is not a static, fixed place. Rather, it's a dynamic location headed on a trajectory, and it's within our power to decide where that trajectory leads. And maybe we can end there. Thank you very much.
It a little bit, and then we can a little bit into the middle.
Yeah.
Would you like to sit?
Either side.
Preference?
No, I don't.
Well,
Do you have a
okay.
preference?
No.
Yeah? Okay.
So thank you very much for the performance, the movie, and adapting it so spontaneously after seeing this book. And I'm just gonna.
It was our conversation actually when you said sometimes you were looking at some of these images, and like in the train station, and sometimes you remember that the new train station wasn't always there, but you can't remember what was there before. And that's I find that really haunting, that idea. And so often that happens to me when I go back to Sheffield. I don't live there anymore, but these buildings are not there anymore. And I start to forget what even was there. And yet these spaces were places that cultivated me, It's kind of a haunting thing.
Mm-hmm. Especially because if it's something that you pass maybe every day and you think, I know it, I will always remember, you maybe hear that it will be destroyed or changed, but then if it's gone, you can't remember anymore. And I think this made me just think of when you were speaking about this B-side geographies and landscape that you kind of like preserved in your book, Afropean, but now they changed again, and they might be lost, but also they might have been changed in a good way. So, and I was also thinking when you were speaking in the beginning about the B-side of the music records, that sometimes the B-sides, they became more popular than the A-side in the end. So I was wondering, is there maybe, because there are some success stories of the B-sides, even though in the beginning they are maybe seen as something less valuable, not so well preserved, and maybe also neglected. But is there a way that B-sides can become maybe successful or just be seen and be preserved through your experience?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because after visiting Carl Jung's house at the weekend, about literally maybe 3 houses away, these are massive houses, so that's half a mile probably, was Tina Turner's house. And I thought, how interesting that this woman who was born in segregated, in a black neighborhood in segregated Tennessee, ended her life in this kind of millionaire's playground. And it brings up ambivalent feelings, you know. I always feel like that with the B-side, especially within the context of capitalism. I always wonder if what should be the outcome of the B-side, and what does a success story look like from the B-side? Because I think what I worry about is so often when things get commodified or become successful, they lose the energy of the B-side and become the mainstream. It's interesting. I'm thinking a lot. There's a very interesting cultural theorist in Britain called Mark Fisher, and he's interested in what happened after the fall of communism, and the all these celebrations and the Berlin Wall falls. But he actually thinks that, you know, Francis Fukuyama, the economist, called this the end of history. But actually Mark Fisher says, okay, it wasn't the end of history. He got that from Hegel. You know, it's the history with a capital H. Western liberal democracy and capitalism is the only route forward for humanity for the days to come. But Mark Fisher thought that if that wasn't true, what it signified is a kind of failure of the future, in which everything would be swamped under a single system and there was no way out. It's this, and I think the B-side struggles under this kind of politics where. He uses somebody like Kurt Cobain as an example, and Nirvana, where he talks about, you know, there's only one way for Kurt Cobain to go, because he was operating in an era when MTV absolutely loved people who were anti-MTV. That was good for business. They loved the rebels. There was no way out. There was no way to provide an alternative anymore. And so, yeah, I keep thinking about what a successful B-side should be, and like I say, I think that's when I came up with that kind of comparison to the ship of Theseus, in a way, is that it's just not a fixed place, and I think as long as it's left for people to come and go, and is provided with enough resources to survive, then maybe that's enough, and that maybe in the end we have to be happy for people like Tina Turner.
Yeah.
And it's true as well. Another thing I should say is that, you know, so many, during my research, from Josephine Baker to Nina Simone to James Baldwin, black people who lived in Europe, a lot of them died penniless, you know, And so it's quite nice in a way to see Tina Turner not die penniless, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, or maybe success is also not the right word, because it's so related, as you just said, to capitalism. But what I was also thinking of is, because I think that's also a big part of your work with Afropean or all the other projects that you've been doing, kind of like that these B-side stories can also be seen or heard as a part of the history of Europe or of a place, and also that they can be valued and not just being neglected. And so maybe there's the question more into that direction also. How can it the B-side be heard, that it can, also contribute to building the future, so that maybe it's not failing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. I just
like not the success to be like, oh, this is now the great success story, Tina Turner living in rich Zurich, but kind of like from the communities that live in the places that they live in certain circumstances, but still they are not being so neglected that nobody hears them. Is there any way to, one way is of course like speaking about it and documenting it, but kind of like what would society need to do to?
Yeah, I think it's as well about sharing these histories, and that's what I was trying to do through the book. And that's one of the virtues of a book, is that it can take these fragments or these communities that aren't speaking to each other in real life, and make them speak to each other through a single narrative of the book. It's a very messy journey, and it took me about 6 years after making the trip to make sense of it all, and because quite often my research was almost like back to front, where I would travel and I'd meet somebody and they'd tell me their personal history, and then my research would be about placing that personal history in history, in a wider history, which is very often, like there was a guy I spoke to when I was in Stockholm, in the hinterlands of Stockholm, in an area called Rinkeby, which is part of Olof Palme. I saw a quote by Olof Palme there, and his Million program, and he was sort of talking about Namibia and freedom fighting and what was going on in South Africa and Angola, and there was all these like stories through this black man who was he was like a I guess offered asylum in Sweden because he was feared for his life in South Africa during the kind of apartheid years. And so this personal story then brought out this whole wider story about Sweden's role in and Olof Palme in being quite anti-apartheid, and how there's really credible evidence to suggest that South Africa had something to do with his assassination, and so you have all this kind of from these everyday stories, all these other histories that you have to bring together, and I think that's why kind of books are quite important, is because they can show somebody who is Angolan living in Lisbon, how they are connected historically, but also in the contemporary moment with somebody who maybe is Congolese living in Belgium,
Connect these realities and
Yeah,
the history. So you're a photographer, so you work a lot with photography, and you also just jumped on this book, kind of like seeing photographs from Bern. Why is for you photography also an important and suitable kind of like tool maybe to tell these B-side stories or to make them visible? And do you think this has changed over the years when you did the Afropean tour, if I may call it like that, or nowadays?
I think what I like about photography is its kind of ambiguity in its atmosphere, and very often I had a lot of arguments with my editor, good arguments, necessary arguments, that that's when you have a good relationship with an editor, where you can really scream at each other and fight and then knock the book into shape together. And she's from a completely different world to me. I found out that she went to this private school that costs more to go to each year than the combined earnings of my mom and dad when I was a kid. And she did law at Harvard. She was very much a lawyer, actually, in our arguments. But it was great, it was great because we'd find a middle ground together. But one of the things that she realized is, so I wrote this book. I went on this journey 2010, 2011, and it didn't get published until 2019. And then the paperback came out 2020. And suddenly, so like you have this lag of time. So suddenly, by the time the book is really released, it's like people are like, it's like Black Lives Matter's happening, George Floyd, the protests, Brexit. Brexit wasn't even on the cards when I travelled Europe to write the book. So suddenly a book about Black Europe didn't seem so niche. I couldn't get anybody to publish the book preemptively, so nobody would publish it, so I had to go out and self-fund it, and that's why it's such a budget journey in hostels. But that worked out in my favour. I'm glad I didn't, in a way, I had to travel in this kind of way. It gave me a different experience. And so I had to write the book first, and then put the first draft together, and then Penguin and Surkamp and came on board, but not before, And but one of the things that is interesting is initially my editor was constantly trying to turn my words into arguments, into something polemical, and that was because she was thinking of a white audience that feeds off of black anger sometimes, that wants the black anger, and finds it exciting, But really, my book, for those who read it, and I always know if someone's read it or not, is because there's actually a lot of humor in the book. There were some really funny moments and some gentle moments, and of course the polemic is there. This history of colonialism, the subjugation, it's there, but within that are more gentle moments. And my editor wanted everything to lead to an argument about something, and I had to fight my case. And she said, "Well, you just wrote this passage about how this French hip hop came on, and you were in a cafe, and the sun was coming through the blinds, and you were talking to this Congolese man about football. But where is it going?" I was like, "Nowhere. That's the Afro-European experience. That's the black experience in Europe as well, And so one of the great things, it's a very long way of answering your question, but one of the great things about photography is that it can escape those that kind of, the type of photography that I love and try to make. It can escape the confines of an argument. It can just be. It can just and you immerse yourself in the photograph, and it can't tell you biographical information particularly. It can just help you feel the atmosphere of a place, And so the photographs were as important as the words for me, even though in the book it had to be a textbook, so it's more of a non-fiction book. The photographs were shown at Foam in Amsterdam, and I'm currently working on a separate book of the photographs with a publisher called Morel, who is a great independent book publisher, where we're going to deal with, we're going to get the right paper stock, and it's going to be more about the photography and the notes and the kind of ephemera from the journey, because that I didn't know what the book was going to be, and so every day I wrote everything like a fool. Wrote everything longhand in these in these moleskin notebooks. So everything was like, and I had to type it all up, and by the end, when I typed it all up, I had something like 500,000 words, and then I had to edit it to like 90,000. It was a nightmare. But yeah, initially I'd go out every day, and I'd think, right, every day I have to write at least 500 words, very, economical, just 500 words for my diary, and take 5 photographs where I attempted to make a good photograph. It didn't have to, it's hard to make good photographs, but 5 attempts at good photographs every day, and came back with, like 500,000 words and about 10,000 photographs from this collection, and then had to work out what to do with it all, But yeah, the photographs were really important for me.
Just wanted to react on something you said, that with the discussions with your editor, that it's like that she had a certain audience in mind, and she was thinking, coming from a totally different background, and this should be like that, you should speak like that, or you should this makes me think of the last guest professor, actually, the Abdurrahman Waberi. He's the Djiboutian writer, for those of you who don't know it, and he told me that also he had similar discussions with books he published, and some editors said, "Oh, but you're from Djibouti, your language is way too kind of like academic, and it's not possible that it will not be perceived well." Or he told me of another writer from Nigeria, I think, and he wrote about like some histories in Italy, and then some editors also said, "Well, but you should not write about Italy, you should write about Nigeria." And this is also kind of like a I mean, a shocking way to me that it's kind of like perceived like that. This is also kind of like a difference in, how do you say, not on the same level from the B side maybe, and the side that at the moment decides on the culture.
Yeah.
Oh, but it's interesting that you said, like, even though these were like hard discussions and fights, that it seems like it came out the way that you wanted to be and what you wanted to speak about in the Afropean journey.
Yeah, and what the B-side, you know, what's great about it is the logic of the B-side is not always part of the culturally kind of imaginary of the mainstream. I'm thinking, you know, a photographer who is has a quite deep relationship with Switzerland. Actually, is a Teju Cole, photographer and writer, and he, one of my favourite essays of his is about the photographer Steve McCurry, who is signed to Magnum and is one of the world's most famous photographers. Even if you've not heard of his name, you'll know his images. He took, I think, it must be in the top 10 most famous images of the 20th century, and it's called The Afghan Girl. And it was on the front cover of the National Geographic, and it's a young girl with a hood and these piercing green eyes. But what Teju Cole talks about with Steve McCurry is, and it was very prescient actually, this essay. He said how in Steve McCurry's work, he'll go to India and you'll see photographs of poverty and beautiful colour and men in rags and steam engines. And Teju Cole talks about, it's not that these things don't exist in India, right? But he's cropped out modernity. So you don't see laptops, you don't see mobile phones, you don't see these inconvenient things that don't fit a kind of Western view of what they want India to be. And what's interesting is that Teju Cole didn't know this. He was just writing about the images as they were. 6 months after that, it came out that not only was Steve McCurry framing those things out, but was using Photoshop to literally take them out of the images, to take these. And there's a big you know, furore about that. And so yeah, I think for me it's important when you're fighting your case and that you don't let the powers that be, the mainstream, the A side, make your work too clean for their purposes. Now, once the book's in place, I'll play the game. I'll play the marketing PR game. I'll do, but it's once the work is right. You can't let your work be compromised. You know, once it's out, it can be whatever you want it to be. You know, but it has to be the content has to be right. You know, you have to fight those battles and. Not just make it all about what the editor thinks the kind of bourgeois class, who very often are the people who are buying the books, want to read about, you know.
I'm just going to ask one last question, then I open up for the audience, because I'm sure you have many questions, probably too, or remarks. And so you were starting with Bern and saying how you first came here in 2011, and that it might not have changed that much from your visit 13 years ago, but still I wanted to ask you, did you discover now some new aspects maybe from the B-sides in Bern, maybe also through the conversations with your students, and maybe you can say something about what maybe struck you, or...
Yeah, for sure. It's these kind of fragments of the B-side. I mean, Bern, you know, we're living in the old town. They put us up in Junkerngasse, which is not very B-side at all, you know. But then through this kind of back and forth with the students, I've been taken to certain places. The one place that really stands out for me that I was fascinated by was a Gaskessel. And the way that it's this kind of independent space that is not wholly reliant upon government funding, and that's really important. Like, I think 30% of their funding structure comes from government subsidies, you know, but the rest they make themselves, so that their political aims or their cultural aims aren't framed or aren't dependent upon what the government wants them to do, you know. And so it was quite interesting as a point of investigation to work out how for 50 years that place has remained relatively independent, and so that was my kind of big encounter with the B-side. I'm also about to start reading the Burn book, which is something that I can't wait to get stuck into, because it strikes me that that was very busy. Another thing, I had this crazy weekend, young Tina Turner, and then something that really blew my mind was I didn't even know this was on, but I went to Cabaret Voltaire, birthplace of Dadaism, and there's an amazing exhibit. You have to go and see this exhibition if you don't already know about it. The attempts to draw a parallel, well, easily does draw parallels between Dadaist movement and Lee Scratch Perry, who's one of the kind of godfathers of dub reggae, very much underpins, in my research for the B-side and in the publication that I made, we spoke with Mad Professor, who was a big collaborator with Lee Scratch Perry, and formulated this idea of the B-side. And this kind of these parallels that they draw between Dadaism and Lee Scratch Perry is just mind-blowing. And when you go into this space, it's the kind of ultimate B-side, where there is just it's just this kind of huge, beautiful mess of colour and DIY art and just insanity and genius and as particularly used with it being Dada is, in a way, that his use of found objects and the way his life's encoded in these pieces of ephemera and how he puts it all together. And I didn't know how long his relationship with Switzerland was either. He married a Swiss woman and was living in Switzerland before he died. What's that? Yeah. That's right, yeah, for 30 years, all these amazing videos there where it's just him alone, dressed in like an Afrofuturist, with all these kind of, tinfoil hat and all these accoutrements in the middle of this field feeding these cows. And it's just this kind of amazing, I don't know. I think what I got from it was kind of a sense of possibility. And Switzerland for me is a very interesting place because on the one hand, I think Bern specifically is quite a conservative place, and I've noticed that as I travel through it, it's very peaceful and very organized. And if you step outside of that organization, the system you'll know about it. And there's been a few times where there was one time where I got on the train and I'd been on a really nice walk alongside the river, and we got on a tram, and I was with my two daughters and my partner, and we were really excited about just being in Bern early on, and this guy was looking at us and shaking his head, and he was saying, he said, you can't teach some people. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, you have to respect your neighbor, Why are you making all this noise on this tram? And it wasn't like we were shouting, we were just talking to each other as a family. And he was kind of and I noticed a few looks like that every time on the tram. I noticed you can't make too much. And it's interesting as how one person's notion of being polite is another person's notion of being rude. And for me, he was the one who was being rude, sort of having a go at us for having a nice family moment on a tram and talking to each other. But we were being rude to him because we were talking to each other. So it's fascinating, how. But it's been a peaceful place to think, and yeah.
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 You can see that.
I'd
Not
love to
too much excitement going on.
I'd love to come back, but I think maybe 3 months a year is enough,
Yeah. So now I invite you to ask a question. You're going to have the microphone so that the people watching us online can also hear your questions. So who would like to start? Comment or question or also own experiences. Everything is welcome. So if you like.
Good evening. Thank you very much. Just one thought that went through my mind. You were talking about success at one point, and what I was thinking, who defines success? And what's the reference?
Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. And that's what I was talking about in terms of what Mark Fisher talks about is how capitalism has created the framework for what success is. And so even before, he talks about this, even before Kurt Cobain could formulate his artistry and his way through, everything is the route. The only way for Kurt Cobain to go is there's no other way, other idea of what success can even be, because what you do is, if you want to get your music heard, you get signed, maybe by a major label. The major label calls up to the networks, and then suddenly it's off, and there's this one way of doing things which is successful. And I think what I'd like to get back to, and I think my generation specifically of kind of 80s babies, children, really had our heads, our minds warped by capitalism. And it's not that, and with the lack of this alternative vision that was embodied in communism, it was, I even noticed that my older brother and sister, they have a slightly different idea of what success is because they remember the 70s a little bit. But by the time, I came of age in sort of the 90s and 2000s, even the left was like something like New Labour in Britain was really right-wing, and everyone was buying their homes to let out at inflated prices. And it's like, how, it's true, we have to try and redefine what success is. And I don't know how you do that. I mean, I don't know if this is related, but something that comes to mind is when Afropean won the Leipzig Book Prize. The year before, the winner was a Hungarian philosopher called Laszlo F. Foldani, and he's done a lot of work about melancholy, and how and his book that won the prize the year before mine is called In Praise of Melancholy. And the person who was introducing me drew these parallels between my book Afropean and his work in terms of, even though I mentioned there being humor in the book, she says that there's also this sense of kind of melancholy that runs throughout it. And I wonder if there's a kind of reshaping I think, especially through working class politics, a whole generation of working class people got really used to the idea of comfort and wanting comfort. After the tough lives in the 60s and 70s, it was comfort through consumption. And I wonder if we can work through a kind of melancholia, and if that might be a useful way, instead of this kind of inane giddiness and consumerism that is offered by capitalism. Is there a way to use melancholy? And because I think a lot of us are struggling with mental health, I think especially after COVID and the way the world is at the moment, and maybe melancholy is not something to run away from. And maybe if you don't run away from that sense of melancholy, you can start to redefine what success really is. But I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Hi. I was kind of, when you started with the film and, the breaking down of those buildings, and again, the melancholy that you spoke about, or that you feel when something gets lost that you kind of didn't realize was important till sometimes it's gone. Then you kind of realize, okay, yes, this was kind of really important to me. One thing that struck me about, what should I say, maybe being African or so, is that very often our culture and is documented by others. We don't have a history of, this little part of Africa that I know, I grew up there and all, but still, it's like it's not something we do. It's when I was I tried to learn ballet, and there were books where step by step, this is what you do, like, I don't know, clock, 5 o'clock, this is where you put your foot, and then you do this. You can dance ballet by reading a book.
Yeah,
you can play music by reading reading little black notes on lines.
Yeah.
And you can cook by knowing how many grams you need to put of this and this.
Yeah.
And that is I never saw that in Africa. And I find that kind of interesting when I think of also people like Socrates or Jesus, who never wrote. You know,
Yeah.
either you're there and you listen and you understand, or you've missed it, you know. And it was afterwards that people would say, wow, that was so cool, let's document this, and
Yeah.
so on. And we are grateful they did that. But I find it, for me, people like Socrates also, they have that African spirit of, listen, we are living now, I'm speaking now, either you take the message and make it part of you, or I don't really care, you know?
Yeah.
And that's the way Africans cook, that's the way they make music, that's the way they paint their houses. I mean, the idea came to me because of also of a photographer. She was documenting those houses that they paint so beautifully in the north of Ghana and other parts of Africa. And she said they would spend hours and hours coming out every day, painting, mixing the colors, and then it would rain and it would be gone,
Yeah.
and then start again.
Yeah.
And she said, how can that be? You should try to fix it.
Yeah.
They didn't care.
Yeah.
And
It's interesting.
Yes, and for me, sometimes this is what I miss in Europe. While I admire this documentation of everything is important and noted, archives,
Yeah.
you know. And in Africa, you don't have that. Your archives are here, they are here.
Yeah.
And
Storytelling.
in storytelling, which unfortunately no more gets done, and then suddenly your culture's gone.
Yeah.
Or somebody else is telling you what your culture was, and I don't know what to do of it. It frustrates me that we don't document. But it also I also feel that that's also part of us that, you know, okay, so the world is put together differently now. What am I going to do with it? It's like, oh, okay, what am I going to do with this? And for me, that is very human, maybe one of the most human things. And unfortunately, I don't go very often, but whenever I go to Africa, this feeling of homecoming, even though I don't even speak the language, but this feeling of homecoming, of being with people who throw at them what you want, they're somehow going to do something with it that gives me strength, that I don't have here. That here I'm like, oh, I need to do this, and oh, if I don't do this, what will happen? And funnily enough, in Ghana, I don't have that feeling. Even though the whole world can go wrong, you know, with a mosquito bite, let's be honest. But yes, I don't understand. So I don't know, should we document? Would that be spoiling who we are? Or, yes, and if we don't document, it's really a pity also. So there's this, I don't know, this contradiction. Sorry, I don't want to hold the mic.
Thank you.
That's something that's beautiful. Thank you for that contribution, because it's something that I was constantly haunted by as I made my journey. I'm thinking a little bit of Glisson's notion of the right to opacity as well, you know, of not having to be clear. And that's something that I tried to encode in my work, but constantly as I was documenting, you know, by the end of it, there was a feeling of, oh, you know, not everyone wants to be documented. You know, like, I kind of set out almost as like, thinking, oh, I'm going to document Black Europe. You know, it's like, well, not everyone wants to be documented. You know, it's like, kind of, there was an assumption there, and quite a Western way of thinking. And the only thing I can say is that, like, I think for me, because I don't have a specific place in Africa, I mean, through DNA tests, I now kind of do, but because it's once removed through the transatlantic slave trade, my blackness runs through African America, you know, and especially, I mean, to go back to Teju Cole, what I love, my dad's from Brooklyn, and he calls Brooklyn one of the world's great African cities, you know, which I really think there's a truth to that. So what I kind of do is kind of try and chart these energies and these, like you say, these kind of ways that things have been passed down without direct influence, whether it be that the notion of the right to opacity, or Paul Gilroy's idea of black vernacular culture, where, or even that idea of like where you know, hip hop tries to reassemble the drum beat that was taken from the people who moved to Africa, so it was a way of communicating. All these hidden ways, and even the way, like, my dad passed down information. You know, the things he wanted to hide, for sure. But also, it was never overt. He'd never sit me down and say, "Son, you need to know that." But when he died, I realized he had these ways of immersing me in these ideas that I had to take part in to understand. It wasn't just given to me. It was like, we'd watch a movie together or listen to some music, and the stories were there, but just not told in an overt way. And it's interesting because, honestly, the etymology of this word Afropean comes from a great blur. And so like, to try and answer your question, I think that there is my idea is to try and blur disciplines where you document on the one hand, which is, like you say, almost, quite a Western thing, but then you try and encode what your documentation with a kind of energy. And this book, Afropean, for me, really is full of my soul, and it's not. It's weird when people fit it into this category of non-fiction or something like that. Because for me, I've been thinking this a lot, and I don't mean this to sound pretentious, but for me, it's close to like a work of art. And I don't mean it's so great it's a work of art. I just mean that to think of it as a non-fiction book feels wrong. It feels more complicated than that, and messier than that, and stranger than that. What was it? We were talking about. I was talking about the blurring of traditions. But what did I want to say before that? I've forgotten where I was going. There was something really interesting. You've made me think about something. We were talking about whether you should document or not document. Let me try. It'll come back to me. But
worried, that through the which is why I don't think your book seems. I didn't really read it as a document.
Yeah,
I did read it more just as a personal experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an experience.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, that's what I was going to say. Sorry, the etymology of the word Afropean, where Afropean comes from, it comes from when David Byrne from the Talking Heads was traveling with his band in Europe on the European tour, and he came across in Belgium this band Zap Mama, and what he talked about seeing in Belgium as well was a surprise, because what Europe hasn't been good at, it's changing a little bit traditionally, is exporting blackness. When you go to America, no one's ever surprised to see black people in America, because part of that historical, the history of America is so rooted in blackness. Whereas still, when people come to Europe, they're kind of surprised. Oh, there are black people in Switzerland, or there are black people. And so he went to Belgium and was shocked to see so many black people in Belgium, and then see it all brought together by the music of Zap Mama. So together they came up with this term Afropean to describe her music. And what she does, especially in the first two albums, is she's got an incredibly complicated story tied up with Congo and Belgium, and Belgian colonialism. But she encodes her music with the sound of the pygmy forest, this polyphony, and then she blends that with kind of sometimes Belgian humor. And so there's this kind of way of telling a story and telling a history embodied in just the sounds of the music. And honestly, because I make music a bit as well, the first thing I thought of with this book was that it was going to be an album. I was constantly looking for, or was it going to be a photo book, or was it going to be... So it just kind of ended up in this weird form. But really, it wasn't that initially that it had to be a book. There was lots of ways it could have been expressed. And constantly, I drew a lot of influence from the Harlem Renaissance poets like Langston Hughes, especially, but also people like Claude McKay, who where you can sort of hear jazz as you read them. And for me, I kept thinking of the music for my generation really is hip hop. And it's not that the words rhyme or anything, but as I was piecing my sentences together, I kept thinking of hip hop, and especially the music of Jay Dilla, who would work out strange rhythms, and so the rhythms of the sentences sometimes are very much influenced by these other things. So like I like to think, other people might read it a different way, but I like to think that the book is haunted by a plurality of stories that aren't just there in black and white in the words. I like to think that there are other energies in that book, but yeah.
A question, yeah. First there, and then you, yeah.
Thank you so much, Johnny, for your thoughts and discussion. Something that when we were talking about melancholia, I was also thinking about nostalgia, because you mentioned Brexit, and I studied in the UK, and I visited the UK just in the sort of year before Brexit happened, and I was kind of struck in a negative way about its kind of nostalgia around just sort of backward looking, in sort of tea parties and all these kind of flags and Union Jacks, but it was very sort of and it kind of was almost like a precursor for Brexit, but I didn't know that Brexit was going to happen because I think nobody believed it would. And what I'm struggling with is the sort of contradiction between, on the one hand, having this kind of nostalgia for the way things were, and at the same time what you're doing with your work, which is like actually trying to recover the struggles and the B-sides, the untold stories, or the things that haven't been given light of day and recognition. And I don't even have a question. It's just what I'm struggling with, kind of to bring together.
Well, no, you're onto something, and actually, Gilroy came up with this term, post-colonial melancholia, to describe that exact state of stasis and nostalgia that Britain feels, and what post-colonial melancholia is for him is the idea that World War II was the last kind of quote unquote good thing to happen to Britain, in terms of it could frequently, I mean, it never mentions the 24 million Russians who died in that war, by the way, but Britain constantly perceives itself as the hero of World War II, and that's the thing that everybody still latches onto, because what came after World War II actually was the withering away of Britain as an empire, and the withering away of its place on the world stage that was once formidable. At its height, the British Empire covered a quarter of the world's landmass, was governed by, the British Empire governed a quarter of the world. And especially after World War II, its position in the world, as it gave way to kind of American imperialism, was massively diminished. And so there is constantly this nostalgia for the kind of not really for the wartime, really. And what's interesting about Keep Calm and Carry On is that was very rarely used. So that's the big thing of like the nostalgia of like the British identity is, no matter what happens, we keep calm and carry on. And that's from these posters that happened in that were designed in World War II with this kind of sans serif font that were apparently pasted all over the buildings during as these kind of semiotics to keep the population going, but apparently that's not true. They were hardly ever used, So even that is a figment of the national imagination, it's a big problem. There's a really great book though by Svetlana Boym called The Future of Nostalgia, where she divides nostalgia into two different types, and one is kind of, I think it's reflexive nostalgia, and I can't remember the other name for this nostalgia she identifies, where she says one nostalgia is all about symbols and all about projecting and protecting an absolute truth. And it's where things like, slogans like Keep America Great Again comes from. It's saying, and it's this nostalgia for a place that never really existed, you know. But then there's this other nostalgia that is more connected to melancholy, where it's like this. And if we look at other cultures, the way that they deal with nostalgia, like saudade, saudade. Saudade. Okay, sorry, Brazil. Saudade. Okay, yeah. So yeah. Saudade, you know that, and that's not something that's just a gentle sadness, isn't it? Rather than, it's not something where it's like, wait, oh yeah, let's go back. It's just sadness at times passing. Also the same in Japan, where you have notions of like mono no aware, which is this idea that of a gentle sadness at times passing. You know, so there are other ways that we can use nostalgia and deal with the fact that time passes and people die and entropy happens and that we can, again, sit in that kind of melancholy. But when it becomes full of pomp and ceremony, that's when you have to be really worried about what nostalgia is and does. And Britain has been full of it. And it's kind of amazing because the country is in an absolute state at the moment. And it's interesting how I think we're at the end of that kind of nostalgia, because all the Conservative government for the last 13 or so years has done is ape that nostalgia for their own purposes. And I think people now realise that it was a house of cards, you know, and that's what Brexit was. Is nothing underneath it, no ideas. You know,
We have one question. Is there also a question online or not? Okay, so we maybe take one question, and if there's another question, we can take that one too, and then I think we need to round up.
Oh, let me present first. Excuse me for the time here, right? I
No.
try to find it here. My wife said, I come with you, but she live here, but they come and try to find. I'm from Brazil. My name is Jader. And since 2000, I have a portal of black community in Brazil. And I don't heard you what you speak about, I read something, but I want to say one thing. I imagine everyone here try to rewrite the hiding history about black people in Europe. You know, have Pope, you know, have Queen, you know, have a lot of information that is hiding. And when I come here, I know everyone is here, try to understand why they hide the history, the real history. And you, I think, the hero, but write something to try to do to try to show the people that have another history to be shown. And thank you so much. Only this.
Oh no, thank you. I mean, what's interesting about this book is it was really powered by community. So we set up an online website, and I initially set it up because I wanted to liaise with people, and you know, and that powered up my travels. So like, if I needed to sleep on someone's sofa, and so much information I got was from this group, this online group of people who for whom the word Afropean resonated. And I was really powered by that community. And what I hope is that even though this is a book that I wrote, is that the book then feeds back into the community. And it's important for me, I think in America, you have these kind of cult of personalities and these individuals who stand out and become the heroes. But for me, it's really important for me to be a part of something bigger, you know. So I really thank you that you appreciate my efforts. But I hope that you know, and it's people like you know, trying to set up community events and organizations that really power up the black community that are the real heroes, in my opinion.
Well, thank you. I think that's a very nice end of this evening. I mean, it's not quite finished yet, because those of you who are here, you're invited now to have a drink at our democracy bar and continue the discussion if you like. And also, as I said, the video will stay online. And I thank everyone for watching, and also you for joining us here and for your questions and comments. I think, well, the discussion will have to go on the B-sides and on how we will speak about it in the future.
Could I say very quickly, I have a guest who's coming to join my seminar on Tuesday, and my seminar takes place, you're all welcome, you don't have to go to the university. It takes place in the main building of the University of Zurich on the second floor, like towards the end. In Bern, sorry.
Yeah.
Do you know, I have this real mental thing where
Weekend trip to Zurich.
no, but
and
it really bothers me where I have my encounter with Switzerland for the first time is my friend who works at the University of Zurich. So I've done many talks at the university, but I have this. It really is so embarrassing. I keep saying Zurich instead of Bern. It's a real weird mental block.
Another country is not so far, 1 hour between Bern and Zurich. So
no,
it's
but
maybe
you know,
kind of
Bern
like the
is
same
Bern.
city,
You know,
right?
Bern is Bern. I'm on Bern side. You know, yeah. So yeah, it's at the University of Bern, 10:15 until 12. I'm having a guest come in, and her name's Natalie Ola, and she's written a book that is one of my favorite books of the year, and it's called Bad Taste, and the politics of ugliness, and it's very B-side, yeah, in the way that it kind of challenges notions of good and bad taste. And it's a fascinating book, and she's going to give a seminar, and then we're going to speak between each other. So you're all welcome if you want to come to that. So
Thank you.
On
Yeah,
Tuesday, 10:15. Yeah.
So we also have 2 more events before Tuesday. So if you are bored and need some more events to go to, and well, on this Thursday, May 2nd, we're going to open up our new small exhibition on the EU and Switzerland, called Die Schweiz, Können wir Schweiz und EU? It can be maybe translated the Switzer EU or Switzerland, so it's a little bit hard to pronounce, but it's about like how we want to speak about the future of the European Union, also its values, but also about the relations of Switzerland and the European Union, which is also kind of some discussions are similar now going on with the Brexit negotiations. So this will start on Thursday, and then next week we're also going to start a series on the global super election year, if you like to call it like that, at the Democracy Bar. And so not only the European Union is holding elections this year, but also about 80 countries worldwide are supposed to hold elections in 2024. And so on May 6th we will speak about elections in India, which started 2 weeks ago and will last until June 1st. And so India is the world's biggest democracy with 950 million people called to the ballot. And so the former diplomat and journalist Bernard Imhasli, and well, he's been living in India for over 30 years. He will speak together with Rekha Oleshak from the Institute of Federalism at the University of Freiburg about the challenge of the election in India, where democracy has increasingly been restricted by the Hindu nationalist government that you also just mentioned in your presentation. So we're going to continue this series with other elections. There's going to be South Africa being discussed on May 30th, and so I hope to see some of you at one of the events, or maybe we see each other again next Thursday, Tuesday, at your event. So thank you very much for watching, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.